development of the Pumpkinvine Corridor Linear Park in Elkhart and LaGrange counties, Indiana. The title is Genesis of the Pumpkinvine. My name is John Bender. I'm conducting this oral history with John D. Yoder of Goshen, without whose vision and efforts we might not have seen the Pumpkinvine peddling and perambulating trail as we know it today. This oral history is sponsored by the Goshen Historical Society. Today is Friday, September 9, 2022. We're located on the trail near Abshire Park in Goshen. Producing the video is 5 Core Media, an educational arm of Goshen College.
I grew up in Boardman, Ohio, which is a suburb of Youngstown. And my interest when I was young was baseball. I was a great Cleveland Indians fan. And I later became interested in tennis. Played tennis in high school and college. I came to Goshen because that's where my parents had gone to school, or at least my mother, and my sister was here as a student as well, and that was our church college, so that's where I came. Well, I have some interesting pictures of me as a 2- and 3-year-old on a tricycle. I don't know what the significance of that is, but it's interesting to me in light of later events. But my first recollection is of a blue bicycle that was much too big for me, but I somehow managed to ride it. And then I got a 3-speed English bike that I used to race in the park department events. Well, the Pumpkinvine today is 17.5 miles long, and it connects Goshen, Middlebury, and Shipshewana, going through Elkhart County and LaGrange County. The first 1.75 miles is asphalt, is crushed limestone, and the rest of it is asphalt. The name of the trail comes from what the railroad called it back when it was a railroad. They had little nicknames for various parts of the corridor, and this was the Pumpkinvine, possibly coming from the winding nature of the trail. We're not sure. The Epley Institute of Indiana University did a study of the trail in 1997, and they found that 72% of the users were bikers, 16% were walkers, 11.5% were runners or joggers, and there were a few others like rollerbladers and birders. So that's the general composition of the trail users. When we started, as far as I know, there was only one trail in Indiana, whereas in Ohio, Michigan, and Illinois, there were a number of trails, but we had almost nothing. So if I wanted to go see a trail, I would go to Kalamazoo and ride the Cal Haven Trail from Kalamazoo to South Haven, Michigan. Well, that's an interesting story. My wife and I were both on sabbatical from, in my case, Goshen College, in her case, the seminary in Elkhart. In the fall of 1988, we located at Oak Brook, Illinois, where she went to school at Bethany Theological Seminary. And of course, I went along and took classes at the University of Chicago, Illinois campus. And I knew about the abandoned railroad that had become the Illinois Prairie Path because my uncle and aunt lived in Wheaton, and I had another one that lived in Glen Ellen, which is where this path was. And so I was interested in checking this out with my daughter, my 14-year-old daughter, and we rode this trail and discovered it was really a very interesting and exciting thing. We would see kids running and walking and biking, mothers pushing baby carriages, and it seemed like a very wholesome environment. And my daughter said to me, "Why can't we do this in Goshen?" So that was really made me think, well, there is the Pumpkinvine in Goshen, maybe that's a possibility. When I got back to Goshen in '89, I asked Irvin Beck to go with me and walk on the corridor from State Road 4, which is now near Abshire Park, to County Road 28, which is the first 1.75 miles. And so we hacked our way through what was basically overgrown with multifloral rose, but you could still see the corridor. I mean, it was still there. And so it was at the end of that year that we got a group together, John Kolb, Irvin Beck, Chet Peachy, Norm Kaufman, and myself. We met around the kitchen table December the 4th, 1989, to see what was possible. Did we think this was something that we could actually do? And it wasn't first by any means. The Illinois Prairie Path that we saw in western Chicago suburbs had been there for 20 years. But there were not very many others, and obviously not any in Indiana to speak of. Not too many. There were like 400 in the nation at that point. We developed, after our first meeting, what we called just an ad hoc committee. And it was the four of us, and then we pulled in other people that we knew. Galen Kaufman, who was a local attorney, joined us shortly thereafter. And we made contacts with the local park departments. We knew that none of us had the expertise to really manage or develop a trail. So we thought we really need to be partners with Goshen Parks, Elkhart County Parks, Middlebury Parks, and LaGrange County as well. And we found a lot of interest among the people at Goshen Parks and Elkhart County Parks, because they had both placed the park or the trail in their master plans that they had developed sometime before that. So it wasn't a new idea with them. It was just that, they never managed to do anything about it. For some reason, it wasn't a priority, or they didn't know what to do, or something. Anyway, so when we came along, we joined with them in partnership to see what could be done. Well, today it's owned by the four entities that manage the trail: Goshen Parks, Elkhart County Parks, the town of Middlebury, and the town of Shipshewana. Well, I think the most critical thing was to engage with the railroad, because there was interest among us, and we wrote letters to the railroad. We tried to engage them in the very early days, and that didn't really seem to spark a lot of interest. So the really critical event was when I went to the National Rails to Trails Conference in Baltimore in June of 1991. And it was there, they had a workshop, it was called Meet the Railroads. And so I headed directly for that workshop to see what I could find out from Penn Central. And I met their railroad representative. His name was Mike Cloud, and I asked him if he was interested in selling the Pumpkinvine. And he said, of course. He'd actually been contacted by other people before this, but most of the other people had wanted to buy one parcel or another parcel. They were interested in selling everything. So as soon as they could find somebody who was interested, that's what they did. And so I invited Mike to come to Goshen. He came then in August of that same year. And John Kolb and I drove him all over the county to look at all the where the railroad crossed the county roads, to see what they thought. Of course, they thought it was a great idea, and so we continued then in conversations with them. And eventually, in June of '92, we signed a purchase agreement with them to buy the railroad, contingent upon us coming up with the money. And in the meantime, we were having conversations with the various park departments, the community. We had a lot of public meetings at the park offices, at the libraries in Middlebury and in Goshen and Shipshewana, to try to engage with the local landowners to let them know what was going on and see what kind of support we would get for them. As it turned out, we got no support from the local landowners. The cities were very interested, the park department was interested, county commissioners not so much. Well, they thought that this was going to be a magnet for crime. Raping, pillaging, and plundering would just be a daily occurrence on this bike trail. And they had somehow gathered anecdotal evidence from, who knows where to prove their point. Of course, they had no data to show that this was true, but that didn't seem to bother them. They just piled up anecdotes, true or not, to show that this was going to be a very dangerous thing. They also argued that the railroad didn't own the land. So how could the railroad sell us the land and make a bike trail when the railroad didn't own it? They thought that all of the land reverted to them as adjacent landowners once the railroad was abandoned. We, on the other hand, took the radical step of checking the documents that the railroad had gotten from the adjacent landowners back in the 1880s, 1890s. We engaged Jim Ingold of Cripe Title to study every single document, every single deed from the adjacent landowners to the railroad to see what they owned. And we did the same in LaGrange County, and they said that the railroad owned at least 85%. And we thought that if the railroad owned 85%, we could at least, do something that could demonstrate the potential for the trail, and that would convince the community that it would be worthwhile. Well, our only arguments really were to write letters to the editor. When people would write letters saying what a terrible thing it's going to be, it's going to invade our privacy, and so on and so on. We wrote letters to the editor. We had these public meetings, and then when we got the trail going, that first section became our demonstration section to show the community what it could be. One of the interesting events that happened was here at Abshire Park in 1995. I was taking pictures as the Abshire cabin was being built, and one of the Goshen Park Department workers came over to me and said, "The Amish person who's building this trail, building this cabin, wants to talk to you." Of course, I was very apprehensive because I'd heard that all the Amish are going to be opposed. It's going to be an invasion of their privacy, blah, blah, blah. So I walked over to him, he shook my hand, and he said, thank you for championing this trail." And I said, what made you, his name was Ori Lehman, so what made you a champion of the trail when all the Amish, I've been told, are going to be opposed? And he said, well, it's very simple. My wife is from southeast Iowa, and there was a trail similar to this proposed in that community. All the Amish were opposed, and yet they went ahead and built it. And after it was built, they said it was the best thing that ever happened in this community. And I remember that specifically. He didn't say, well, we learned to tolerate it. Well, it wasn't as bad as we thought. No, it was the best thing that ever happened. So that really gave me confidence that if that could happen with this Amish community, it could happen with our Amish community as well. Well, the Amish community is by far the biggest group that uses the trail. They use it to get to work, they use it for family outings, they just really enjoy the Pumpkinvine. Yes, well, it wasn't just pushback, it was the threat of lawsuits. The local Farm Bureau president, Mike Yoder, and he organized a group to actively oppose the trail. And he said at the closing, we're going to sue you and prove that you don't own this. Well, our lawyers who had joined us voluntarily, Jim Byron and Jim Brotherson, they got there first. They got to the courthouse first. And we sued all of the landowners in the first 1 3/4 miles to prove that we owned it. And we won. And so that was the beginning. And then we had many, many other lawsuits. I'm not sure, at this point it was 8 or 9, where we were able to prove our ownership either through the courts or through mediation. We had a number of places where we mediated with the adjacent landowners, and we came to an agreement to actually build the trail. Yeah, there were many times we were tempted. One of the things that happened was Indiana Farm Bureau got a hold of our lawsuit and combined it with a whole statewide lawsuit. They were suing U.S. Rail Corp, who was trying to convert a lot of trails, a lot of corridors in Indiana with Penn Central. And when we were joined to that lawsuit, that went down to Indianapolis, which made it much more difficult for our lawyers to be involved on a day-to-day basis. But eventually, we won that lawsuit as well. But yeah, that was a real down point. The trail officially opened in the spring of 1990, here this Goshen section where we are right now. Again, the Ipley Institute, when they did their study several years ago, they interviewed people and asked them how much money they spent. So we have a figure. It was over $3,000 per year that individuals who came to the trail spent for clothing, for gas, for food, for lodging. So when you multiply that times 80, 90,000 people, there's a significant impact. And we also know that the Pumpkinvine Cyclery in Elkhart began and has become very important on the trail directly as a result of the Pumpkinvine. Mooey's Ice Cream Shop on County Road 20 is a direct result of the Pumpkinvine, not to mention Dips on the Vine in Middlebury and the Dairy Queen in Middlebury also benefit. And if you talk to the local bike shops, they will tell you without any question that the trail has been one of the most significant things in improving their business along the trail. Well, all you have to do is go out and ride the trail any day, and you will see extended families riding the trail, groups of Amish, teenagers, rollerblading, people walking their dogs, and it's a great place to meet your friends. I rarely go out any day and I don't meet a neighbor or two who's out also biking. So it's a great social place that's safe for people like myself, who's a senior, to get off-road and be able to travel a great distance in safety. One of the unexpected things that I'm aware of is the fact that we've had daughter and granddaughter trails branch off of the Pumpkinvine. The Abshire Trail goes from the Pumpkinvine to the Monroe Trail. The Monroe Trail goes to Elkhart County Park, Elkhart County Fairgrounds. Also, the Maple Heart Trail goes from Goshen to Elkhart, and the Ridge Run Trail goes from the Pumpkinvine to the Essen House and Greencroft, Middlebury, and Northridge High School. There's still a section of the trail that isn't finished between County Road 20 and County Road 35, and the hope is to finish that in the next year. Most of the trail monies came from transportation enhancement funds from the federal government to the state. These were money set aside within the transportation bill itself, could only be used for bicycle, pedestrian kind of projects. The Department of Natural Resources, through its Recreational Trails program, also contributed quite a few dollars over the years, and Community Foundation of Elkhart County in the last couple of years has contributed significantly to the trail. And locally, we've raised a lot of money as well, but the big chunks came from the federal government. The people who were supportive were extremely trusting in us to actually come through with what we promised. Because when we started, I mean, we had actually 10 years before we had anything to show. And the only thing that, the only thing we had to show were a lot of maneuvering and trying various things. And so they were very trusting. And we tried through our newsletter to let them know the good and the bad that was happening so that they would continue to be supportive. What I learned from the opposition was, you really need to do your homework. If you're going to have a supportive position, you better check the documents. And I should say that this is a classic case of urban people confronting the rural people. The urban people were very supportive, and they had the notion that you really needed to investigate and do your research to get to the bottom of who owned what. And the rural people just believed the rumors that they'd heard, that everything converted to them, everything reverted to them, and everything didn't revert to them. Almost nothing reverted to them. So that was really, in a way, kind of surprising that happened. Well, when I see, parents